interested to hear from Michael. Can you please welcome Michael Sukkar? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Well, good morning, everyone. And Danita, can I thank you for the introduction, and in particular, can I thank you, Danita, for the outstanding leadership that you've shown for your organisation, for the entire industry, and for our country. And I hope today, as you outlined in your opening remarks, that you do have a session that gives you a full appreciation of just the important role that you and the message that you portrayed during the election played on the ultimate election outcome. And I know politics and the fray of politics is not necessarily where many of you intend to engage, but the reality is the choice that was in front of the Australian people and the choice and its impact on your industry was so significant at this election that we are very grateful for the advocacy and the courage that you showed in standing up, not for yourselves and your members, but in the end standing up for the tens of thousands of Australians who, due to your hard work, will find it just that little bit easier to have a secure, safe and stable roof over their head. And in the end, isn't that what we are all here for? As Danita had said, I am very grateful to have been appointed in addition to Assistant Treasurer Minister for Housing. And in my first iteration as Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, when the Prime Minister was the Treasurer at the time, he and I often spoke about the importance of housing. And I can assure you there are few, if any, people in the Parliament that are as dedicated and committed to your industry as our Prime Minister. Can I, in addition to acknowledging Danita just now, acknowledge Headley Davis, your President, all of the board members and the representatives of other Master Builder Associations around the country that are here today. It's wonderful to see you. The government's agenda is quite ambitious as to housing. And one of the things I've said to my colleagues since the housing portfolio was recreated in this term of Parliament is that the founder of our party, Sir Robert Menzies, spoke about housing almost more than any other topic. I don't necessarily think many of you will do this in your spare time, but if you do have cause to read some of his early writing and speeches, it was an issue that was fundamental to his belief of what made Australia what it is, and is therefore a core foundation of the Liberal Party. And I take that very, very seriously over the next term of Parliament. As you've probably seen from my public statements, we are quite confident about the housing market, notwithstanding its significant challenges. We know that the dark clouds of housing taxes that were hanging over the market at the election, I think, depressed confidence. After the election, I think that those dark clouds were swept away, and there's been a range of factors that I think have assisted in confidence more broadly. Our tax cuts, which have seen about $14 to $15 billion hit people's bank accounts just in the last few weeks. A slight lessening of credit restrictions, which I think have been one of the most significant impacts on the market in recent times. The inevitable consequence of the Banking Royal Commission and other bad conduct by lenders has seen a risk aversion and a restriction of credit that has significantly impacted the market. I think we're starting to see that lessen, and over the next quarter to 2 quarters, we are confident that that is going to improve. Of course, Reserve Bank interest rate cuts are another factor that I think are going to improve confidence as we move into next year. From my perspective, I am busily working away, and in fact, I will need to leave here at 9 o'clock to go to our joint party room where I'll be taking and seeking approval from my colleagues for the enabling legislation for the first home loan deposit scheme. The Prime Minister announced the scheme during the election, which will enable first home buyers with a deposit of as little as 5% to obtain a government guarantee to enable them to get finance to get into their first home. That will commence on the 1st of January, so we've got a lot of work to do between now and then, but we're confident that that will create some wonderful opportunities for first home buyers. But As Danita has rightly pointed out, and in all of these forums, and I think in all of our conversations when I meet with the master builders, there's no doubt that the issues around housing, the issues around affordability, basically start and finish with supply. And any of you that follow the media closely will see that rarely is there a time I speak about the challenges in housing without acknowledging that supply and the constraints on supply are no doubt the biggest single factor. So whilst the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, the First Home Super Saver Scheme, a range of other programs, including the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which I'll speak about, are all worthy on their own, if we don't have state and territory planning schemes that provide predictability, that provide certainty for investors, that bring down the holding costs and in the end allow you to get houses out of the ground, all of those sorts of measures will never have the same kind of impact. So many of you will have seen on Sunday, we announced a big package for Tasmanian housing where we effectively waived a $157 million debt owed by Tasmania to the Commonwealth. Now, one of the reasons why we agreed to that request from the Tasmanian government was, yes, there's absolutely acute housing issues in Tasmania. They've got a rental vacancy rate of 0.5%, to give you some idea of just how tight that market is. But importantly, the state government, in addition to making significant investments in housing, committed to serious reforms of their planning and zoning regime. Predictable statewide planning that was going to ensure, and a stated objective of this planning scheme, to ensure that it was able to keep up with its projected population growth. Danita spoke about the gap nationally. Our view as a Commonwealth will be we are keen to partner. We're keen to assist state and governments in any way, shape or form, provided we can see a demonstrated reform to what I think is the single biggest choke point to supply in our country, and that's truncated, unpredictable planning schemes. You all know it much better than I do, but I think it's the main game in town. And sadly, as Federal Housing Minister, it's not something I have direct responsibility for, but we are very keen as a federal government to do everything we can to encourage the states to move in the sensible direction that enables planning to support filling the gap that Danita spoke about. One of the things that the Prime Minister, then Treasurer, and I set up in 2017 was the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation. It's been a great success. It's done a lot. It's achieved all of the objectives we'd hoped it would achieve in its first 12 months, but we certainly have greater ambitions for it. For those of you who don't know, it's an independent Commonwealth entity which administers a bond aggregator which essentially funnels government-backed low-cost finance into the community housing sector. It also has a $1 billion infrastructure facility to assist in getting projects off the ground that otherwise wouldn't happen to get new supply into the market. Again, the Commonwealth Government putting its money where its mouth is to have additionality in supply and to unlock some of those supply hurdles. So we're very keen, and there's a number of expressions of interest as we speak that the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation is considering in relation to that infrastructure facility, and we'll shortly be able to announce some really exciting projects that sort of funding is going to assist. Of course, that is in addition to the Commonwealth property divestment approach, which again was something that was championed by the Prime Minister and I a couple of years ago, when we basically said to ministers and departments, surplus Commonwealth land must be utilised for housing at first instance. And we need to be an exemplar for the states. I can't, on one hand, in good conscience, criticise state governments for slow, truncated planning schemes, for not releasing land if we are ourselves sitting on surplus Commonwealth land. So I know it's not the silver bullet. I know in the end it's not even a necessarily significant addition to supply to the market, but quite important that we set an example that where there is surplus Commonwealth land, we utilise it. We recently completed the sale of Bulimba Barracks in Brisbane, which was completed very recently, and Maribyrnong, which is a gorgeous 127, although slightly contaminated site. In Maribyrnong, 127 hectare site is progressing well with a number of very large and interested parties, which will deliver in the order of 3,000 to 6,000 new dwellings 8 kilometres from the Melbourne CBD. It's quite extraordinary. So between the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, who will also administer that scheme, the First Home Super Saver Scheme, and examples just like we saw on Sunday, where the federal government encourages and supports state governments to undertake the necessary planning reforms that are going to make your lives and the lives of your customers easier in getting houses out of the ground or projects off the ground, are going to be my focus over the next 2 years. And from a Treasury team's perspective, there's no doubt that we are wanting to see responsible but free-flowing credit, certainly much freer flowing than it's been over the last 18 months to 2 years, and I think there are some encouraging signs if you look at lending data that was just released yesterday, moving in the right direction. On a Treasury side, that will be important because, as you know, without that necessary finance to get the projects off the ground or to allow, in many cases, the first home buyer to get that loan, those projects don't go ahead. So we are here to support you. We're here to listen to all of your advice, and I've already met with Danita a number of occasions since the election. You certainly have an open door in my office because we respect the contribution that you make to our economy, the Australians that you employ, but more importantly, the stable, secure families and households, and therefore the stable and secure communities that you deliver to Australia through the work you do. So, Danita, can I thank you for having me here today, and I think we're going to go to Q&A, but I appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
While anyone's thinking about a question, because we have got, I think, about 5 minutes available for questions. Michael, one of the availability in NIFIC is the infrastructure facility. And one of the biggest complaints from our members are the developer charges that have been generally passed on to those developing, while the infrastructure facility is obviously interconnected with the community housing. What difference do you think that may make to ensuring that we decrease the costs associated with development of new green and brownfield sites?
Well, developer charges are, obviously they're the bane of your life, and I must say, I'm not being gratuitous here in criticising any one jurisdiction, but if I certainly look at developer charges in New South Wales, they have grown exponentially. I mean, I suppose our view as a federal government is we're not here to compensate for developer charges that are levied at a state level, because I think that wouldn't encourage reform. I think all that would do is essentially shelter state governments from the problem. The NIFIC infrastructure facility has an explicit purpose, and that is to unlock projects that are borderline, that are going to increase supply quite significantly in some cases, but there's just a small impediment, either through some practical infrastructure or some aspect of the project that that sort of funding or concessional loan would unlock. It's explicitly there to unlock projects that wouldn't otherwise happen. They're not there to make projects that are going ahead anyway more economic for any of the parties, including state governments. And that's where the fine decision has to be made by NIFIC. Of the $1 billion, the bulk of it is concessional loans, but there is grant funding in there as well. So you can see, Danita, the opportunities for that facility, and we have specifically targeted it to community housing providers. But one of the points the Prime Minister and I made when we set this up is our ambition for NIFIC is much greater than what it is at the moment. But our view was it was good to have NIFIC with a relatively tight remit, let them meet those tests early on, and then we would start to think about how its functionality grows, how the role it plays grows. Now, we're already adding to it because NIFIC will administer the first home loan deposit scheme, and we've been working very closely with NIFIC and Treasury in setting that scheme up. But over time, Danita, there's nothing to say that NIFIC can't have a similar role directly with the private sector as it does with community housing providers. Now, that's not within its mandate necessarily at the moment, but our ambition has always been, to put it at its simplest, that NIFIC is there to facilitate more supply of housing. Now, we started off with a limited remit to an extent with community housing providers because there was an explicit shortfall and need in that sector. But Danita, I can absolutely envisage circumstance where NIFIC's remit widens even further, not just in its mandate, but in its practical administration, that would see it working with members in this room.
I might ask a supplementary question, and that is in the relation to NIFIC obviously was of interest to the industry super funds in terms of its bonds. We obviously have a number of industry funds in particular interested in infrastructure and building, including CBUS, who will speak later on today. Do you think there's an opportunity to really consider greater funds from superannuation in terms of housing? But also they've got to balance up their sole purpose test in terms of the financial returns to its members. Is the government open to looking at further opportunities to incentivise superannuation investment?
Yeah, well, you're right. The super funds were interested, and that first bond issuance that the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation got away was 5 times oversubscribed, so it was a very successful bond issuance, and now it's issued some construction loans as well. I suppose, the whole debate around build to rent and what needs to be done for build to rent, and I've often asked people, well, what do you need from a Commonwealth perspective for build to rent? What effective tax rate would you need to unlock that sort of investment? And often the point comes back to me that it's really about land tax concessions and other state taxes being the impediment. But there's certainly a pent-up demand, shall we say, for further investment from institutions like the industry super funds. I suppose my point, though, is, and I was meeting with a very large investor in Sydney just a few weeks ago who essentially had to walk away from a $1.5 billion project because of the uncertainty with their planning scheme. Now, there doesn't seem to me to be a shortage of capital that's available to be invested into housing. There doesn't seem to be a capital strike. Quite the contrary, there's a lot of pent-up capital seeking to find its way into projects. The choke point, the difficulty, is getting those projects out of the ground. So I suppose my point is, I could understand the argument even more so if there was a lack of availability of capital for these projects and we needed to attract super funds into it. But there is a surplus of capital that's trying to find a home, but our state planning schemes are making it extraordinarily difficult.
I know we've possibly got one quick question if anyone wants to ask from the audience, but I am also mindful that Michael needs to get to a meeting at 9 o'clock.
I've got another 5 minutes.
You've got another 5 minutes? Any other questions? Bob, wait. Oh,
Thank you. Michael, you mentioned a surplus of federal government land and in particular mentioned a couple of larger projects. Will that flow through to smaller projects and give smaller builders and smaller operators an opportunity to deal in those sorts of manageable parcels of development rather than focusing on the major contractors? There's a wealth of knowledge and experience with smaller builders and developers. Will that opportunity flow through to smaller sites and will we get an equal opportunity at them?
Yeah, look, very good point, and I don't normally give away confidential discussions in ministry meetings, but it's quite interesting that, and I don't think my colleagues would object to this, that in a very recent ministry meeting, we were speaking just about this topic, not just in the context of building, but more broadly in procurement and making sure that second, third and smaller tier players were certainly encouraged to participate, certainly in regional areas. To answer your question though, absolutely, we are focused on the larger parcels because that was going to deliver the most new supply into sort of some acute areas of acute need, and we naturally focused on difficult but large parcels. There are a remarkable array of small Commonwealth parcels around the country, and I remember quite vividly when I was first appointed and first given responsibility for housing, I sort of asked a very dumb question. I didn't think it was that dumb, but you know, what land does the Commonwealth hold? No one could give me an answer because we had no central register. And after Angus Taylor and I established a sort of a register of Commonwealth land, and we required all of the departments to give us all of the data on what they held, for months we had departments that were finding little pockets of land here and there that they'd just forgotten about, just a lazy hectare here and there. So there's a huge range of those smaller sites. You could appreciate the bureaucratic workload involved with divesting anything is quite significant. So, you know, the effort to divest a large parcel has a higher marginal rate of return than divesting something that's a bit smaller. But where it's surplus to requirement, our message to line ministers and departments is very clear: get it off the books. There's no point having it sit there. Maribyrnong, yes, it's a contaminated site, so that was a bit unusual, but Maribyrnong was sitting there for 20 years. And I just wish someone had taken a decision 20 years ago to get this thing moving, because there'd be houses on it already. So we're very keen, irrespective of the size of the parcel, to get it out the door. And you're right, those smaller parcels will be more manageable for much smaller players.
Conscious of time,
Just
Michael.
one more,
You
maybe?
can happen one more. Anyone got a burning question up there? No. Matthew, right? The Tasmanian.
Don't mention the war.
Thanks, Anita. Matthew Pollock from Master Builders Tasmania. Minister, I just wanted to say thank you for relieving the debt for the Tasmanian social housing, and for giving some encouragement to the state government to fast-track amendments to their planning scheme. But my question is really about the first home buyers scheme that you'll be implementing soon.
Yeah.
Given that there are about 60,000 first home buyers a year that we're seeing at the moment, is there any scope perhaps in the future to expand the program?
Well, thanks, Matthew. There's actually 110,000. Well, there was 110,000 first home buyers last year, which was the highest number in 10 years. We think there's, once you apply income caps and house price caps, which will inevitably be part of the scheme, that yes, there is going to prima facie be a surplus of demand to the scheme. The scheme has been limited to 10,000 for a number of reasons. One of them being that we don't want to cannibalise what is a functioning and healthy LMI market. The last thing we'd want to do is to put that into jeopardy, because I think that could have some obviously significant and unintended consequences. So at the moment, we are very keen to land the first home loan deposit scheme from 1 January, have product available. We'll obviously see how it goes. If it's a raging success, then it's a nice problem to have, because the Prime Minister has made clear publicly that, of course, we would look at other ways that we can support those first home buyers. But at this point in time, 10,000's the number, and look, let's see what the response is like from the market. I think at that point in time, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Well, Danita, can I thank you again? And really, you'll probably hear this a lot today, but thank all of you for having the fortitude, no doubt, to support Danita and the board in what was a really, really important time for your industry and time for our country, and the support that you showed and the courage that you had in fighting for those convictions is something for which we're very grateful and very keen to deliver on and to repay that faith. Thank you very much. Thanks, mate. All good?